Imagine a world where childbirth was not just a moment of joy, but a step into the shadow of death, where mothers whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary with every breath, and where the first cry of a newborn could mean survival, or a fleeting miracle. Tonight, we'll journey into the birthing chambers of medieval Europe, a place filled with hope, fear, and rituals that shaped entire generations. If you find peace in these quiet explorations of history, and you'd like more stories told slowly, carefully, and with gentle detail, I invite you to subscribe and join me again. For now, settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us step together into the past. Faintly in the damp morning air, the cobbled lanes are slick with rain from the night before, and the bells of the parish church ring slowly in the distance, calling the faithful to prayer. In this world, women walked with purpose yet always under the weight of expectation, the expectation to marry, to bear children, to keep households running, and above all, to ensure the continuation of family and community. For medieval women, life was inseparable from the promise and peril of childbirth. To understand what childbirth meant in the Middle Ages, we must first step into the daily life of women. From the humblest peasant wife to the most adorned noble lady, the rhythm of life was measured not in hours or years, but in cycles of fertility, pregnancy, and motherhood. A woman's body was rarely seen as her own. Instead, it was thought of as a vessel, for lineage, for faith, for the future of her family. From the moment a girl reached the age of menarche, whispers of marriage and motherhood were not far behind. In most medieval European villages, marriage was not a matter of romance, but of survival and alliances. Among peasants, it meant securing labor for the fields and heirs for inheritance, however modest. Among the nobility, marriage was often arranged in childhood, binding families together through dowries and bloodlines. Yet in both cases, marriage was followed almost immediately by pressure to conceive. A bride's worth was silently measured in her swelling belly, in how soon and how often she could present her household with new life. But childbirth was not celebrated without shadows. The grim reality was that for many women, pregnancy was a gamble with fate. The risk of death in childbirth was frighteningly high. Some historians estimate that 1 in 3 women might not survive their childbearing years. In every village, there were widowers with motherless children, and in every noble hall, there were stories of young brides lost to fever or bleeding during their confinements. Women grew up knowing this truth, that their greatest duty was also their greatest danger. Religion offered both comfort and anxiety in this delicate balance. The Church framed childbirth as part of Eve's curse. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. The pain of labor was seen as divine punishment for original sin, yet also as a holy trial, a moment when the Virgin Mary herself might intercede. Women prayed to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, whose story of emerging unharmed from the belly of a dragon made her a symbol of deliverance. Amulets bearing her name or tiny relics of her story were kept in birthing chambers, tucked into pillows or clasped in desperate hands. Every labor was not just a physical ordeal, but a spiritual battlefield where sin, salvation, and survival collided. Daily life for medieval women prepared them, in ways subtle and harsh, for these inevitable trials. From youth, girls worked alongside their mothers, kneading bread, fetching water, spinning wool, mending clothing. Their bodies grew strong from labor, though often malnourished from poor diets. Among peasants, women carried baskets of grain, churned butter, and even helped in the fields, their muscles hardened by necessity. Among nobles, though tasks were lighter, the body was no less burdened by the constraints of tight-laced gowns, the stillness of embroidery, and the pressures of courtly decorum. But whether bent over fields or sitting beneath painted rafters, all women carried the shared knowledge that they would one day face the dangers of childbirth. The birthing chamber was a space shaped not only by necessity but by culture and imagination. In the medieval mind, the world was alive with unseen forces, demons lurking to steal infants, witches casting spells, saints watching from the heavens. Childbirth was believed to draw the attention of these forces. The opening of a woman's body was seen as a moment of spiritual vulnerability, and so protective rituals abounded. The threshold of the birthing room was marked with blessed salt or holy water. Charms were hung over the bed, sometimes a knife to ward away spirits, sometimes a relic from a pilgrimage. Words of prayer were muttered constantly, not only for the mother's body but for the very soul of the child, which might leave the world as swiftly as it entered. Women supported each other in these times. Midwives, usually older women of the community, carried the weight of experience. They were repositories of knowledge handed down not in books, but in whispers and practice. They knew which herbs might ease pain, which prayers might calm fear, and which positions might coax a struggling child into the world. They knew, too, when death was near. Their presence was both reassuring and feared, for they walked with women into life and sometimes into death. For noble women, childbirth took on a public dimension. A lady of rank was expected not just to bear children, but to bear heirs. Her pregnancies were observed with anxious scrutiny, her successes or failures tied to the fortunes of dynasties. Chronicles record noble women giving birth surrounded not only by midwives but by ladies-in-waiting, servants, and sometimes clerics. Privacy was a luxury rarely granted. The body of a queen or duchess was not entirely her own, it was a matter of state. Failure to produce children could bring disgrace, annulment, or even political collapse. Yet despite these differences in wealth and circumstance, all medieval women shared in the fundamental truth of childbirth, that it was a passage lined with uncertainty. Rich or poor, loved or unloved, all faced the same labor pains, the same fear of infection, the same prayers whispered in the night. Childhood mortality loomed large in this landscape. Women knew, even as they labored, that survival of a child was not guaranteed. Diseases, poor sanitation, and fragile health claimed infants in staggering numbers. Baptism was rushed, sometimes performed moments after birth, for fear the child might not live. The soul needed safeguarding before the fragile body slipped away. A mother might cradle her newborn only briefly before laying it in the arms of a priest, anxious for the sprinkling of holy water and the murmured words of salvation. These experiences shaped the psychology of medieval women in profound ways. Joy and grief were bound tightly together. A mother might bury one child and conceive another within the same year. Her arms might feel both the warmth of a swaddled infant and the cold of a tiny body prepared for burial. Women learned resilience in this cycle, but they also carried scars, silent grief that stretched across a lifetime. In art and literature of the period, these themes echoed constantly. Illuminated manuscripts showed scenes of Mary and the Christ child, idealized visions of divine motherhood. Yet medical texts, written by monks and scholars, recorded the practical realities, diagrams of wombs, remedies for difficult births, instructions for managing fevers and bleeding. Between theology and medicine, between devotion and pragmatism, women found themselves suspended. They were both exalted as mothers and blamed for their suffering. They were praised for bearing life and scolded for harboring sin. To walk in their shoes, we must imagine the sounds and scents of their world. The birthing room might be dim, lit only by tallow candles. The smell of smoke, sweat, and herbs would mingle heavily in the air. Outside, church bells rang or neighbors whispered. Inside, voices rose in prayer, in cries of pain, in urgent instructions from the midwife. The moment of birth was a storm contained within four walls, a tempest of body and spirit, life and death. As the Middle Ages wore on, changes slowly unfolded. Contact with Arabic medical texts brought new theories to Europe. Physicians, almost always men, began to write about childbirth, though they rarely attended births themselves. They regarded the process from a distance, as something to be studied, dissected, theorized. Yet the true work remained in the hands of women, the mothers who endured, and the midwives who guided. Their knowledge, unrecorded and often dismissed by male scholars, was what sustained communities through centuries of uncertainty. In the end, the world of medieval women was one where childbirth defined existence. To live was to risk death in giving life. To be a woman was to know that your body was both sacred and perilous, honored for its power and punished for its weakness. It was a world where every cradle stood beside a grave, and every lullaby might be followed by a lament. This, then, was the foundation of medieval childbirth, not the moment of labor alone, but the entire world that surrounded it, the faith, the fear, the daily realities, and the silent strength of women who carried on despite it all. As the months of pregnancy drew on, a woman in medieval Europe lived in a strange tension of hope and fear. To her community, her swelling belly was a promise of new laborers for the fields, of heirs for noble lines, of continuity for the fragile fabric of family life. Yet to her, it was also a weight of uncertainty. Each flutter inside her womb carried the memory of friends who had died in childbirth, of infants lost before they could walk, of whispered stories of mothers who screamed and bled into silence. Preparation for birth was never only practical. It was emotional, spiritual, and deeply cultural. In the early months of pregnancy, there was little fanfare. Many women kept their condition private for as long as possible, knowing that miscarriages were common and that drawing too much attention invited gossip or ill will. In villages, neighbors watched with sharp eyes, and in noble courts, the rumors of a lady's belly could become political weapons. A woman might whisper her fears to a trusted midwife or confessor, but otherwise, she endured the changes quietly. As her belly grew undeniable, preparations began. The birthing chamber, usually a simple room in her home, would be made ready. In peasant cottages, it might be no more than a bed pushed against the wall, the floor swept clean, herbs hung from the rafters to mask odors and ward off evil. In noble households, rooms were sometimes specially arranged for confinement, with curtains drawn to shut out light, tapestries hung to muffle sound, and special beds prepared with linen sheets. Privacy was limited, but ritual mattered. These rooms became small fortresses of hope. The midwife's role was central. Often called well before labor began, she would visit the expectant mother, observing her health, advising her on food, behavior, and prayer. In some places, midwives were licensed by local authorities or the church, sworn to uphold moral and practical standards. They were instructed not to use sorcery, not to endanger the child, not to interfere with baptism. Yet many midwives combined practical knowledge with charms and rituals, straddling the line between medicine and magic. Their reputations depended on outcomes, and women trusted them more than distant physicians. To prepare for birth, mothers turned to both the natural and the supernatural. Bundles of herbs such as rue, sage, and pennyroyal might be hung in the chamber. Oils of lavender or rosemary were rubbed on the skin, believed to bring calm and protection. Some carried charms inscribed with prayers or wore girdles said to have been touched to holy relics. One famous example was the so-called birthing girdle of Saint Margaret, a long strip of parchment covered in sacred texts, wrapped around the mother's waist during labor, believed to ease delivery and guard against death. Prayer was constant in these months. Women prayed to the Virgin Mary, the ultimate mother, for intercession. They prayed to Saint Margaret, Saint Anne, or Saint Bridget, saints tied to the mysteries of fertility and childbirth. They also relied on the power of community prayer, neighbors and family members lighting candles at shrines, murmuring rosaries, and promising pilgrimages if the birth went well. The fate of one woman's body became a spiritual concern shared by many. The household also prepared practically. Warm water would be ready, cloths washed, knives sharpened, not for violence, but for cutting cords or, in grim cases, opening a womb if the mother died before the child was born. Swaddling cloths were folded, small cradles prepared, though these were often handed down from child to child. In noble houses, nurses and wet nurses stood ready to receive the infant, but among peasants, the mother herself or female relatives would take on the burden immediately. Emotional preparation was perhaps the most complex. Women lived with the knowledge that childbirth might kill them. In some places, expectant mothers confessed their sins and received the last rites before labor began, as if preparing for death. Wills were sometimes written during pregnancy, ensuring that land, possessions, and even care for surviving children were arranged should the mother not return from her lying-in. This somber acknowledgement did not lessen the joy of anticipation, but it gave it a sharp edge of realism. To give birth was to step into a battlefield armed only with faith and endurance. As the due date approached, the woman entered confinement. In many regions, this meant withdrawing from daily work and secluding herself in the birthing chamber. Curtains were drawn, doors closed, visitors restricted. The belief was that the womb, opening to release life, also opened the woman to danger from spirits and the evil eye. Darkness, warmth, and stillness were thought to protect her. In noble courts, this period of seclusion could be elaborate. A lady might disappear from public life for weeks, her chamber guarded, her presence hidden until she re-emerged with a newborn. But confinement was not silence. Inside the chamber, preparations had a rhythm of their own. Women gathered, the midwife, female relatives, trusted friends. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, voices low, movements deliberate. Some sang hymns, some prepared herbal teas, some simply waited with nervous hands. The expectant mother lay or sat, breathing heavily, her mind caught between the world she knew and the unknown future that pressed upon her body. Among peasants, these rituals were less ornate but no less meaningful. A small cottage might be crowded with women, the smell of smoke and earth mingling with sweat. Babies cried in the background, neighbors came and went with news. Yet even in such humble surroundings, the sense of sacredness lingered. The birthing chamber was a threshold between worlds, and all who entered treated it with respect. Medical theories of the time also influenced preparation. Based on the writings of Galen and later Arabic scholars, medieval medicine viewed the body through the lens of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Pregnancy was thought to disturb these balances, and childbirth was a process of violent rebalancing. Midwives and mothers followed advice about diet, avoiding foods thought to provoke excessive heat or cold, moisture or dryness. Some texts recommended eating sweet almonds, drinking warm milk, or avoiding salted meats. These practices were not always effective, but they reflected a desire to impose order on a chaotic process. Preparation extended even to the unborn child. Mothers were advised to avoid frightening sights or sinful acts, lest they mark the baby in the womb. Sudden movements, heavy lifting, or even staring at deformities were thought to impress themselves on the child's body. The unborn was seen as deeply connected to the mother's experiences, shaped not only by her flesh but by her imagination and morality. This placed heavy responsibility on women, adding layers of anxiety to already fragile months. In noble households, astrologers were sometimes consulted to determine favorable times for birth. The alignment of stars and planets was believed to influence the child's destiny, and predictions about character, fortune, and health were made long before the infant's first cry. Amulets bearing planetary symbols might be placed in the birthing chamber, blending cosmic belief with Christian ritual in a fusion characteristic of the Middle Ages. As the day of birth drew near, silence and prayer deepened. The woman's body grew heavy, her steps slower, her nights restless with discomfort. Neighbors whispered about signs, the shape of her belly, the way she carried herself, the dreams she confessed. Some believed that cravings hinted at the child's sex, or that the way a woman's face glowed predicted a boy or girl. These superstitions were rarely challenged, for in a world of uncertainty, any hint of knowledge was grasped eagerly. The midwife, more than anyone, held the household in suspense. Her authority, drawn from years of experience, guided the preparations. She inspected the chamber, checked supplies, reassured the mother, and set rules for who might enter or leave. Her word was law in those tense days. Some midwives carried scars of past failures, haunted by mothers or infants they could not save, but they pressed on, knowing their presence meant survival for many. And so, in a dimly lit room filled with herbs and candles, with prayers murmured against the hum of silence, with women's hands steady and ready, preparation reached its end. The mother lay waiting, her body poised on the edge of agony and miracle. Outside, the village carried on. Children ran in the lanes, bells rang for evening prayers, fields swayed in the wind. But inside that chamber, time slowed. The world contracted to the size of a single body, a single womb, a single mystery. The stage was set. The midwife at her post, the saints invoked, the charms hung, the water warmed, the prayers rising. All was ready. Soon the labor would begin, and with it, the raw truth of medieval childbirth, a truth no preparation could ever fully master. The moment of birth, long anticipated with dread and prayer, arrived not with sudden drama but with the slow, relentless rhythm of a woman's body giving way to nature. In medieval Europe, labor began in silence, a tightening in the belly, a steady ache in the back, a wave of pain that made a woman pause in her daily work. A peasant wife might feel the first pangs while bending over a pot or gathering water at the well. A noblewoman might feel them while seated at embroidery, her needle pausing mid-stitch as her face tensed. Wherever it struck, the body announced its hour with undeniable force. News spread quickly through the household. The midwife was summoned if she was not already near, and the birthing chamber became the center of gravity. Women gathered, mothers, sisters, neighbors, servants, ladies-in-waiting. Men stayed outside, pacing or praying, their exclusion almost universal. The birthing room was a woman's world, a place where feminine knowledge and solidarity reigned. Inside, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. Candles flickered against walls, filling the chamber with smoky light. Herbs burned in small pots to mask odors and ward off evil spirits. Holy relics were placed within reach, a rosary laid upon the sheets, a parchment inscribed with the words of Saint Margaret, a vial of holy water from a distant shrine. The expectant mother, her face already pale with pain, clutched at these tokens as though they were lifelines. Labor could last hours or even days. The midwife, experienced and calm, moved between watching the mother's body and managing the room. She timed the contractions by instinct, noting the intervals, judging when to urge movement and when to insist on rest. The woman might be encouraged to walk, to squat, to kneel, or to recline on a birthing stool, depending on local customs and the midwife's judgment. The birthing stool, a low wooden seat with a hole in the center, allowed gravity to aid delivery, and was often used in villages. In noble houses, women might labor in bed, propped with cushions, attended constantly. The sounds of childbirth echoed through the room. Groans, prayers, whispered encouragements, sometimes piercing screams that carried beyond the chamber's walls. Pain was expected, even sanctified, a punishment for Eve's sin, but also a path to grace. Women called upon the Virgin Mary in their agony, crying, "Holy Mother, help me!" believing that Mary, too, knew the pain of bringing forth life. Some clutched relics so tightly their knuckles whitened, as though the saint's power might travel directly into their bodies. Midwives employed every tool they knew. Warm compresses were laid on the belly. Oils were rubbed on the skin to relax muscles. Herbal brews of pennyroyal, chamomile, or rue were offered to ease discomfort, though their effectiveness was uncertain. Charms were whispered over the mother's head, sometimes prayers written on scraps of parchment, and placed beneath her pillow. At times, knives or iron objects were placed nearby, not for use but as protection against unseen forces believed to threaten the laboring woman. As contractions grew stronger, the woman's body trembled, sweat glistening on her brow. Attendants wiped her face, offered sips of water or wine, and murmured words of encouragement. Some women bit down on cloths to muffle their cries, others screamed openly, filling the chamber with a raw chorus of suffering. The midwife guided her, urging her to breathe, to push, to endure. Hours stretched long, measured in the rise and fall of pain. Complications were common. The child might come slowly, positioned awkwardly in the womb. The mother might bleed heavily or faint from exhaustion. In these moments, the midwife's skill was tested. She might attempt to reposition the baby by hand, a dangerous and painful task. She might call upon stronger herbs, or insist on certain prayers, begging divine intervention. When death loomed, decisions had to be made quickly. If the mother died while the child was still in the womb, a grim procedure known as a caesarean post-mortem might be attempted, cutting into the lifeless body to save the infant's soul through baptism. These moments cast a dark shadow over the birthing chamber, reminding all who watched that life and death hung in precarious balance. Yet many births ended with triumph. After hours of struggle, the final pushes came. The cries of agony turned sharper, more urgent. Then, a rush of wetness, a gasp from the midwife, and the tiny wail of a newborn filling the room. Relief swept through the chamber like fresh air through a closed window. Women wept, laughed, crossed themselves. The mother, exhausted, collapsed into her pillows, her body trembling, her face streaked with tears and sweat. The baby, slippery and fragile, was lifted by the midwife, who cut the cord with a knife or scissors, tied it with thread, and wrapped the infant in swaddling cloths. In noble houses, a nurse or wet nurse might take the child immediately, but in villages, the mother often held the infant herself, despite her exhaustion. For a brief moment, joy banished fear, and the room echoed with coos and blessings. But even in these first minutes, anxiety lingered. The infant's survival was uncertain. If the child appeared weak or stillborn, the midwife might quickly perform an emergency baptism, sprinkling water over the tiny body while murmuring holy words, ensuring the soul's passage to heaven should the body fail. This urgency reflected the medieval obsession with salvation. Even a moment's delay might condemn a soul to limbo. For healthy infants, baptism followed soon after, often within days, but for the frail, it was performed at once, sometimes in the very chamber of birth. The mother's ordeal was not yet over. The placenta had to be delivered, and bleeding managed. Midwives massaged the belly, pressed upon the womb, and monitored the flow. Excessive bleeding was feared above all else. Some mothers slipped into fever or weakness in the hours after delivery, their bodies unable to recover. The midwife remained vigilant, tending to the mother's wounds, offering broths or wines laced with herbs, and instructing attendants in care. For the mother, emotions surged in waves. Relief at surviving, joy at seeing her child, fear of what lay ahead. Her body ached, her mind swam, her soul hovered between gratitude and exhaustion. Women often described themselves as reborn after labor, as though they had crossed through death's shadow and returned. This sense of survival, fragile and profound, bound them to other women across generations, a sisterhood of suffering and endurance. In noble courts, childbirth sometimes carried ceremonial weight. Witnesses were called to verify the legitimacy of heirs, ensuring that no substitution or fraud occurred. Chroniclers recorded the births of princes and princesses, noting the hours of labor, the health of the child, the thanksgiving masses offered afterward. Yet beneath the grandeur, the experience was the same: a woman writhing in pain, her body tested to its limits, her fate uncertain until the final cry of life filled the chamber. Among peasants, the process was humbler but equally sacred. Neighbors gathered outside, listening for the infant's first cry. When it came, cheers or prayers rang out, echoing through the village lanes. The news spread quickly. Another life had entered the fragile tapestry of the community. Food and drink might be shared, gifts of bread or eggs brought to the family, small tokens of solidarity in the face of life's dangers. The experience of childbirth in medieval Europe was thus both universal and intensely personal. It was a moment when time slowed, when every breath and contraction carried immense weight. It was a battle fought in flesh and faith, where survival was uncertain and miracles were demanded. It was a threshold crossing, a passage between worlds, where women carried not only the future of their families but the burden of their own mortality. And yet, through all the pain, fear, and risk, life continued. Women bore children, buried children, and conceived again. They endured, not because they had a choice, but because their world demanded it. Their cries echoed through centuries, and their resilience shaped the course of history. In the quiet afterbirth, when the infant suckled weakly at the breast, when the mother drifted into exhausted sleep, when the midwife cleaned her tools and whispered prayers of thanks, the birthing chamber returned to silence. Outside, the world continued, bells rang, markets bustled, fields swayed. But within those walls, something eternal had occurred, the raw mystery of life forcing its way into the world, one painful, miraculous birth at a time. The birth itself was only the beginning of a much longer journey, for both the mother and the infant. In the medieval world, survival after childbirth was never guaranteed, and the moments that followed the first cries of a newborn were as sacred as they were perilous. To understand the world of postpartum life in medieval Europe, we must step into the dimly lit chamber, where the midwife, exhausted from long hours of work, now turned her attention to safeguarding two fragile lives. The mother, drenched in sweat, trembling from pain and exhaustion, lay in her bed, often a simple wooden frame piled with straw mattresses, linens, and woolen blankets. Around her, the women of the household, neighbors, and perhaps a few relatives bustled to and fro, clearing away the soiled cloths, washing her face, murmuring prayers of thanksgiving. They had seen death hover close, for childbirth was not only a miracle but a brush with mortality. If the mother had survived, it was cause for celebration, but celebration in whispers, tempered with caution, for danger lingered even in the hours and days that followed. For the infant, the first task was to establish life. The midwife would cut the umbilical cord with a sharpened knife, scissors, or even a shard of pottery if nothing else was at hand. She tied it with thread or linen, making a knot that would dry and fall away in time. If the child was weak or silent, the midwife massaged its tiny chest, rubbed its limbs, or even blew warm breath across its face to awaken its lungs. Prayers to the Virgin Mary, patroness of mothers and children, often accompanied these acts of care. Sometimes charms, whispered incantations, or even the sprinkling of holy water were invoked, for it was believed that unseen forces hovered near, eager to claim a child's soul before baptism. Baptism itself was of utmost importance. The Church taught that an unbaptized child's soul could not enter heaven, and so families hastened to perform the rite as quickly as possible, sometimes within hours of birth. In cases where the infant seemed frail, midwives themselves were granted authority by church law to perform emergency baptisms, sprinkling a few drops of consecrated water and whispering the holy words. Only then could parents breathe more freely, knowing their child's soul was safeguarded, even if its body proved too fragile to endure. The care of the mother was no less critical. Medieval custom prescribed a period known as lying in, a time of seclusion lasting anywhere from a few weeks to over a month. During this time, the mother remained indoors, confined largely to her bed. This was partly for rest and recovery, but also for ritual purity. The medieval church, drawing from biblical notions, considered a woman who had recently given birth ritually impure until she underwent a ceremony of purification known as churching. Until that time, she was discouraged from entering holy places or engaging in normal community life. This seclusion created a liminal space, either fully excluded, nor fully reintegrated into the rhythms of the village or household. While lying in was intended to shield and heal, it was often a lonely and fraught period. Women were vulnerable to infection, fever, and hemorrhage, dangers little understood by medieval medicine. Midwives and older women advised certain diets to restore the body: broths, warm milk, soft breads, and herbal infusions meant to strengthen the blood and calm the womb. Popular herbs included fennel, sage, chamomile, and rue, each chosen for their supposed properties. Some households provided wine sweetened with honey, believed to cleanse and energize, though others warned against spirits, fearing they might unsettle the humors of a weakened body. The emotional dimension of postpartum life was also profound. In an age when death was common, joy and grief walked hand in hand. A mother might cradle her newborn with fierce tenderness, her eyes searching for signs of vitality, while at the same time knowing she might lose the child within days or weeks. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 children did not survive their first year. Families lived with this knowledge not as a distant statistic, but as an intimate reality. Every child was both a gift and a gamble. Swaddling was the first practice to shape an infant's life. Babies were wrapped tightly in strips of cloth, binding their arms and legs close to their bodies. This was believed to ensure proper growth, prevent deformity, and keep them warm. To modern eyes it might appear harsh, but to medieval families it was an act of protection, cocooning the fragile newborn in a kind of fabric womb. The swaddled infant would often be laid in a wooden cradle near the mother's bed, rocked gently by siblings or attendants, or carried from place to place by the ever-busy midwife. Breastfeeding was the natural expectation, though not always the reality. Mothers were encouraged, even pressured, to nurse their own children, for breast milk was considered more than food. It was thought to transmit qualities of character and health. Yet wealthy families often employed wet nurses, women hired to feed infants with their own milk. This practice carried both social prestige and moral controversy. The church frowned upon it, fearing that a wet nurse's character, morality, or even sins might be passed to the child through her milk. Still, in noble households, wet nurses were common, allowing elite mothers to preserve their figures, social obligations, or fertility for future pregnancies. The postpartum chamber was a space of both care and confinement, but it was also infused with ritual. Amulets might be tied near the bed, small crosses, charms inscribed with protective words, or even bits of iron to ward off evil spirits thought to prey upon vulnerable women and children. Candles blessed at Candlemas or Easter were sometimes lit to guard against sudden death or the malice of the devil. In some places, salt was placed in the cradle as a safeguard, echoing ancient traditions of purification. Gradually, as weeks passed, the mother's strength returned. The ceremony of churching marked her reintegration into society. This ritual, often held around 40 days after childbirth, resembled both thanksgiving and purification. The mother would enter the church, often dressed in modest but festive garments, carrying a candle. The priest would offer prayers over her, giving thanks for her survival and symbolically cleansing her of the impurity associated with childbirth. After this, she was once again considered fit to resume her full role within family, community, and church. Yet for many women, the return to normal life was shadowed by new burdens. Medieval families often expected large numbers of children, and so the cycle of pregnancy and childbirth resumed quickly. Few methods of contraception were reliable or permitted, and women might face pregnancy again within a year. Thus, the postpartum period was not only a recovery but a brief pause before the wheel of fertility turned again. The impact of childbirth rippled outward into the household. Fathers, though largely excluded from the birthing chamber, now entered the scene. They might proudly present their child to neighbors, oversee the arrangements for baptism, or call upon godparents, whose role was vital both spiritually and socially. Godparents became second parents in a sense, their bond with the child extending into adulthood, creating a network of kinship that strengthened community ties. Still, sorrow was never far away. If the mother did not survive her lying-in, the household plunged into grief. A widowed father might struggle to care for the newborn, often relying on female relatives or seeking a wet nurse. If the child perished, the grief was profound, though medieval parents, accustomed to loss, often tempered their mourning with resignation and faith. They believed the child's soul, baptized and pure, had flown to heaven, a comfort, even as the cradle stood empty. The legacy of these postpartum practices reveals much about medieval values. Birth was not merely a biological event but a deeply spiritual passage, one entwined with religion, community, and the fragile line between life and death. The lying-in period underscored the vulnerability of mothers, the urgency of baptism revealed the fear of damnation, and the swaddling of infants displayed both care and anxiety over survival. Every custom, from herbs to amulets, spoke to a society grappling with uncertainty, seeking order in a world where fate was often cruel. As the mother emerged from her chamber, pale but smiling, and as the child grew stronger in its cradle, the family rejoined the rhythm of medieval life. The echoes of chants, prayers, and whispered superstitions lingered in the air, testifying to the precarious miracle of survival. In this way, postpartum life was both an ending and a beginning, the closing of one ordeal, the opening of another chapter in the ceaseless cycle of family, faith, and endurance. Childbirth in the medieval world was never an isolated event. It was not merely the intimate drama of one woman and her child. It was also a social, religious, and cultural act that resonated through the entire fabric of medieval life. From the grand halls of noble estates to the modest huts of peasant villages, childbirth touched every corner of society. To fully understand its place in the medieval imagination, one must look beyond the birthing chamber, into the wide web of superstition, tradition, and legacy that shaped how families and communities experienced this universal event. The medieval world was steeped in belief, and childbirth was at the very heart of those beliefs. At a time when science was rudimentary, when medicine leaned heavily on Galenic humors and ancient authorities, unseen forces were blamed for complications, deformities, and deaths in childbirth. A woman's behavior during pregnancy was said to shape her child's body and soul. If she gazed too long at something grotesque, it was thought the child might bear a mark resembling it. If she ate immoderately, the child might inherit gluttony. If she failed to pray, her child might be weak in spirit. Thus, the moral burden of pregnancy was heavy, linking the body of the child to the mother's every thought and action. Superstitions extended to the very moment of birth. Amulets were tied to the bedposts, crosses, relics of saints, or even humble objects such as iron nails or knives, believed to ward off demons. Evil spirits were thought to lurk near women in labor, seeking to claim souls at their most vulnerable. Midwives sometimes whispered incantations or traced protective symbols in the air, mingling folk magic with Christian faith. Holy relics were placed on the mother's abdomen to ease delivery, or a priest's stole might be draped across her body as sacred words were murmured. The Church, for its part, sought to guide and regulate these practices. While it condemned overt pagan charms and spells, it tolerated, and even encouraged, prayers, relics, and invocations of the Virgin Mary. Indeed, Mary herself became the archetype of holy motherhood, her image often invoked during labor. Women prayed to her not only as the Mother of God but as a fellow mother, one who understood their pains and fears. She was, in many ways, the most powerful protector of women in childbirth, her presence felt in every whispered Ave Maria uttered between contractions. Yet despite the spiritual comforts, childbirth remained bound by a cold reality. It was one of the leading causes of death for women. This knowledge shaped medieval society in profound ways. A woman's worth was tied to her fertility, but fertility itself was dangerous. The paradox was cruel. Women were valued for producing children, yet every pregnancy threatened their lives. Men, too, were touched by this tension. Husbands might father many children but lose wives in the process, forcing remarriage to secure heirs and maintain households. Entire dynasties rose or fell depending on whether women survived childbirth long enough to bear sons. Among peasants, childbirth's legacy was woven into the rhythms of survival. Families depended on children not just as heirs but as workers. Every infant that lived to grow was another set of hands for the field, another voice to carry on family traditions. The loss of a child was thus both emotional and economic, diminishing the household's strength. Among nobles, the stakes were different. The birth of an heir could secure political alliances, preserve titles, and stabilize kingdoms. Queens and noblewomen were celebrated for producing heirs, yet they bore the heaviest dangers, their bodies often exhausted by repeated pregnancies. History records many noblewomen who died in childbed, leaving power vacuums and sparking succession crises. Superstitions also shaped the way communities interpreted the outcomes of birth. A child born with a deformity was often seen as an omen, a warning from God or a punishment for parental sin. Some saw such children as cursed, others revered them as touched by divine mystery. Monstrous births, as they were called, circulated in chronicles, feeding medieval fascination with the strange and the supernatural. A two-headed infant, or one born with a tail, became not only a family's private grief but a story retold in taverns and monasteries, a reminder of divine judgment, or the mysteries of nature. For mothers who survived, the postpartum period was only the beginning of new responsibilities. They carried not just the weight of nurturing infants, but the burden of embodying ideals of womanhood. The good mother was pious, obedient, tireless in her duties. Yet beneath these ideals lay the reality of exhaustion, fear, and grief. Many women buried children before they themselves reached old age. Some buried several. Still, their resilience formed the backbone of medieval society. It was through their bodies, their labors, and their endurance that communities endured famine, plague, and war. The midwife's legacy, too, deserves attention. These women, often unlettered, wielded immense practical knowledge, passed down orally through generations. They were guardians of both life and ritual, present at the threshold of existence. Yet their power was also suspect. The Church sometimes eyed midwives warily, fearful of their use of charms or their knowledge of herbs. In later centuries, during witchcraft panics, midwives were disproportionately accused, their role in childbirth twisted into accusations of infanticide or dark sorcery. The legacy of suspicion followed them, even as communities continued to rely on their skill. One of the most striking legacies of medieval childbirth was the persistence of ritual purity. The practice of churching, in which women were ritually cleansed and reintegrated after childbirth, symbolized society's ambivalence toward female fertility. On one hand, motherhood was revered; on the other, it was tainted by associations of blood and impurity. This ambivalence shaped how women were treated, not only in religion but in law and custom. A woman was both exalted as a mother and marginalized as unclean. As centuries passed, medical knowledge slowly grew. Universities began training physicians, though these men were rarely present in ordinary births. Instead, they advised from afar, writing treatises in Latin that midwives could not read, prescribing treatments few could afford. Yet even these early physicians reinforced the idea that childbirth was not merely a natural process, but a dangerous, mysterious ordeal requiring divine aid. It would not be until the Renaissance and beyond that systematic changes began to alter maternal care. But in the medieval era, childbirth remained largely the province of women, shaped by their shared wisdom, faith, and fears. The legacy of medieval childbirth stretches into our own time. Modern medicine has transformed birth, reducing risks that haunted women for centuries. Yet echoes remain. The rituals of support, the anxieties over purity, the blending of faith and medicine, all are rooted in the deep past. Even today, in moments of crisis, families whisper prayers, cling to amulets, and seek meaning in outcomes beyond their control. The medieval mixture of superstition and faith reminds us that childbirth has never been merely biological. It has always been cultural, spiritual, and profoundly human. And so, when we look back on the medieval birthing chamber, what do we see? We see fear, yes, but also resilience. We see superstition, but also deep faith. We see women bound by duty, yet demonstrating astonishing strength. We see families mourning their losses, yet rejoicing at survival. We see a society where every cry of a newborn echoed against the silence of those who never drew breath, where every mother's survival was a victory against staggering odds. The legacy of medieval childbirth is, in the end, the legacy of endurance. For all the danger, for all the sorrow, generation after generation carried on. The mothers of medieval Europe gave birth not only to children but to a world that endured through famine and war, plague and death. Their stories, whispered in shadowed chambers, remembered in baptismal records and church rites, live on in the very fabric of history. And so, as we close this journey into medieval childbirth, we are left with a deeper appreciation for those who bore life into a world that offered little comfort in return. Their labor was not only physical but spiritual, not only personal but communal. Their struggles and their strength remind us that every life, no matter how fragile, was a triumph against the odds, a miracle fought for with blood, prayer, and love.